Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are looking at a stack of documents that, well, honestly, they feel like they shouldn't even be stapled together.
Right.
If you look at this first pile, it's all high level constitutional theory about DC statehood. Very abstract, very political.
And then the second pile is what? The gritty economic spreadsheets of public sector labor rights?
Exactly. Specifically, the right to strike.
It feels disjointed. I mean, usually you keep your constitutional scholars in the ivory tower worrying about federalism, and you keep your labor economists, well, on the picket line worrying about wages.
They don't usually attend the same happy hours.
Not at all.
And to be fair, most people do treat them as totally separate silos. But the research we're unpacking today argues that if you do that, if you keep these topics separate, you are missing the entire picture.
You're missing the connective tissue.
Yeah, the source material claims there is a hidden thread, a single massive psychological and legal concept that ties the struggle for DC statehood and the struggle for worker rights together.
And that thread is agency.
Agency. Now, that is a word that gets thrown around a lot, in corporate seminars or self-help books. It feels a little buzzy.
It can be.
So before we go any further, how are these sources actually defining it?
Well, it's less about a definition and more about a diagnosis of a condition. The core thesis here is that both the residents of Washington, D.C., and the public workers within the city are operating under the exact same structural defect.
Okay.
It's described in the text as governance by permission.
Governance by permission. That sounds so polite, almost bureaucratic. But when you dig into the text, the implication is actually pretty bleak.
It is bleak. It's the antithesis of consent. I mean, think about the architecture of power in D.C. The city leaders, they can pass a local law about taxes, about policing, whatever.
Trash collection.
Right, trash collection. These are decisions made in good faith by elected officials who live in the community. And then what happens?
Well, then Congress gets involved.
Exactly. A congressional oversight committee filled with people who do not live there, who are not accountable to those voters, can just step in and stall it.
Or just override it completely.
Just because they can. Because they hold the permission slip. The city operates only as long as, the parent allows it to.
And the sources argue you see the exact same mechanic in the workplace.
For public servants, yeah.
Okay, connect those dots for me. Because most people would just say, well, a job is a job. You have a boss.
But this is about the power dynamic of negotiation.
Mm-hmm.
Without the right to strike, collective bargaining in the public sector is described in these texts as performative.
Performative? Like theater.
In a way, yeah, in the sense that the outcome is basically predetermined by the stronger party. If you don't have the leverage to walk away, to withdraw your labor, you aren't negotiating a contract.
You're asking for a favor.
You're asking for a favor. You're hoping the other side is in a benevolent mood.
So if I can't quit or, collectively stop working, I'm not really a partner in the deal.
You're a dependent. Precisely. And that really sets the stage for the mission of this deep dive. We aren't just reciting labor codes or complaining about Congress. We are looking at the psychology of powerlessness.
And the dangers of something the text calls defensive governance.
We have to talk about that. And honestly, we need to map out the strategy the sources propose for fixing it. Because the solution they offer isn't just ask nicely.
No, it is definitely not that. But let's start with the feeling of this, the anatomy of powerlessness. Because the sources use some very uncomfortable analogies to explain what this lack of agency feels like.
They do.
And the one that jumped out at me immediately was the household analogy.
It's a heavy comparison. The text compares the current situation of DC residents and workers to living in a dysfunctional, authoritarian household.
Walk us through that, because usually when we hear about federal intervention in DC or even management intervention in a workplace, we hear about relief funds or grants or
legal settlements.
We frame them as help.
We do. But the source asks you to look at why that help is arriving. In a dysfunctional home where there's abuse or neglect, you might get a visit from child welfare.
Or the police might show up.
Right, the police might show up to stop a shouting match. In a city, you might get a federal emergency check to plug a budget hole.
Right. It stops the immediate bleeding.
But the source calls this an intervention of management, not a solution. If the police come to a dysfunctional home, they might stop the immediate violence. They create a temporary ceasefire. But, and this is the critical part, do they change the power dynamic that caused the problem in the first place?
No. Once the police leave, the person with all the power still has all the power.
Exactly. The abuser is still in charge. The victim is still dependent. The source argues that if your well-being depends on an external authority deciding to save you periodically, you don't have agency.
You have a caseworker.
That's it. You have a caseworker.
That is a brutal distinction. But it makes sense. I mean, if I have to wait for Congress to pass a budget to know if my trash gets picked up, I'm not really in charge of my city.
And they apply this to the workplace, too. If a union has to rely on a court injunction or some mediator to get a fair wage because they are legally forbidden from striking, they aren't building power.
They're just managing their own dysfunction.
They are surviving, not thriving.
Which leads us to the second metaphor in the text, which felt, even more personal. The relationship. The text explicitly compares the ban on public sector strikes to an exploitative personal relationship.
It frames it entirely around the concept of exit.
Okay, I want to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Yeah.
Because when most people hear public sector strike, They don't think about relationships or philosophy. They think about disruption.
Sure, of course.
They think, I don't want the subway to stop running, or I need the trash picked up. It feels aggressive.
That's a fair reaction. It is disruptive.
Yeah.
But let's look at the economics of a relationship. If you are in a partnership where you are legally forbidden from leaving, can you ever truly resolve a conflict?
Well, no, because the other person knows you're stuck.
They're stuck.
They have zero incentive to compromise.
Exactly. The source says that the ability to withdraw, whether that's leaving a partner or withdrawing labor, is the only thing that forces a recalculation of value.
A recalculation of value. Break that down for us.
It just means making the other side realize what you are actually worth. If I can leave, you have to treat me well enough to make me stay.
But if I can't leave,
you only have to treat me well enough to keep me alive. The text argues that banning strikes mirrors these sort of patriarchal structures where one party's refusal to recognize the other's autonomy is just normalized.
So without the threat of a strike, the employer, the government in this case, never has to actually ask, what is this worker worth? They just have to ask, what is the minimum we can pay them?
Correct. And that brings us to the strategic side of this whole thing. Because if you are living in that state of permission, how do you govern? How do you even act?
This is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah.
The sources identify a specific political strategy that has taken over DC. They call it defensive governance. But before we define that, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. Why are DC leaders so defensive in the first place? What are they afraid of?
They're afraid of the past repeating itself. The source is very clear about the fear of retaliation.
Retaliation from Congress.
Yes. And for our listeners who might not know DC history or who think of DC just as monuments and museums, this isn't some vague anxiety.
Now, this is a trauma response.
It is. In the 1990s, DC faced a massive financial crisis. And what did Congress do? They stripped away its local power. They installed something called a financial control board.
Okay, explain the control board. Because that sounds like something out of a dystopian novel.
It basically is. It was a group of unelected overseers appointed by the federal government who had the final say on how the city spent its own money.
So the elected mayor, the elected council.
Sideline. Completely sideline.
This sounds absolutely humiliating for a local government.
Yeah. It was. It was a suspension of democracy. And even though the control board is gone now, the threat hanging over DC today is if you mess up, if you get too loud, if you let the workers strike and the budget gets weird.
The control board comes back.
Or worse, you lose home rule entirely.
And home rule being the ability to elect your own mayor and pass your own laws.
Right. So the fear is existential.
So the natural human instinct, and definitely the political instinct, is to keep your head down.
Don't rock the boat.
Don't give them an excuse.
And that is defensive governance. It's trying to survive by being invisible. It's walking on eggshells so Dad doesn't get mad.
But here is where the source offers a blistering critique of the status quo. It looks at the last 13 months under Mayor Bowser's administration.
And the verdict.
The verdict is a failure.
Yeah.
The argument is, okay, you governed defensively, you stayed quiet, you didn't push for the right to strike because you thought it would anger Congress, you didn't push aggressively for statehood. Did it work?
And judging by the tone of these documents, I'm guessing the answer is no.
The answer is a hard no. The source argues that silence and risk avoidance does not protect home rule. Congress is still interfering.
They recently overturned DC's criminal code reform, for example.
Exactly. It didn't strengthen labor. Peace tensions are higher than ever because workers feel ignored. And it didn't improve outcomes for residents.
That is such a powerful point. We often think playing it safe keeps us safe. But the source is saying, at best, you preserved a fragile status quo.
At worst, you normalize the overreach.
Precisely. By acting like you need permission, you reinforce the idea that they have the right to control you. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
You're validating their dominance by tiptoeing around it.
Right. If you act like a child who is afraid of punishment, they will treat you like a child.
And this connects to a historical warning in the text that I found really fascinating. It talks about the danger of the cycle.
Yes, this is the oppressor-oppressed cycle.
Explain that. Because usually the narrative is pretty simple. The bad guys are in charge. We need to get the good guys, the people who represent the community, into power, and then everything gets fixed.
Well, the source warns that it's just not that simple. It says there's a profound danger that those who were once oppressed can become oppressors themselves if power is simply redistributed without accountability.
So a union leader who fights the power could turn around and be just as authoritarian to their own staff. Or a local mayor who fights Congress could be tyrannical to local workers.
Exactly. The text says, heroes who step in to save the day can inadvertently enable villains. Survivors of a bad system often replicate those coercive practices because that's the only model of power they've ever known.
So if you've only ever seen power used as a blunt instrument,
that's how you're going to use it when you pick it up.
So it's not just about changing the players, it's about changing the game itself.
It's about changing how power works structurally. The source argues that true change requires checks, norms, durable mechanisms. You can't just hand the keys to someone else and hope they're nice.
You need a system that ensures fairness, regardless of who is driving.
And there's a philosophical anchor here that the source quotes. St. Augustine.
An unjust law is no law at all.
It's a classic quote, but they are applying it in a very modern, very specific way here.
How so? Because that sounds a bit close to anarchy. just ignoring laws you don't like.
They aren't suggesting lawlessness. They are framing laws that deny self-governance or good faith bargaining as instruments of domination.
Okay.
So if a law systematically denies people the power to govern themselves, it fails the basic purpose of lawful order. It's not justice, it's just control.
So challenging those laws isn't rebellion, it's a correction.
That's the argument.
Okay, so we've diagnosed the problem. We're in a house where we have no say, we're in a relationship we can't leave, and keeping our heads down hasn't worked. So what does the source say we should actually do? Because complaining about the problem is easy.
The strategy is agency through readiness.
Readiness? That sounds proactive. But what does it mean practically?
Well, the source argues against treating this labor issue as a standalone provocation like, let's just go on strike tomorrow to prove a point.
Which would be dangerous and likely illegal.
Very. Instead, it suggests a broader strategy of lobbying Congress now.
Wait, lobby Congress now? Even with the fear of retaliation we just talked about.
Yes, but it's about how you lobby. The argument is that you need to prime the members of Congress. You need to do the educational work, the policy development, the coalition building right now.
So you don't ask for the vote today.
You prepare the ground.
So that when the political terrain shifts.
Exactly. Maybe there's a lame duck session after an election. Maybe the composition of Congress changes in 2027. The point is, when that window opens for 5 minutes, D.C. needs to be ready to jump through it with the legislation already written.
I see. Don't wait for the window to open to start packing your bags. Be packed and standing by the window.
Governing from a position of confidence rather than fear. That's the quote.
But I want to drill down on the specific proposal mentioned in the text, because I want to go back to that fear of chaos I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, the safety concern.
When people hear public sector right to strike, they imagine firefighters walking off the job while houses burn or nurses leaving the ICU. Does the source address that? Or is it just power to the people?
No, it absolutely addresses it. And this is where the technical detail is really important. The draft proposal mentioned isn't a free-for-all. It's not a wildcat strike model where everyone just walks out at noon because they're angry.
So what are the guardrails?
It involves a rigorous multi-step process. First, you have mandatory mediation. You have to sit down with a neutral third party to try and work it out.
And if that fails?
You go to fact-finding.
Fact-finding.
That's where an independent arbiter looks at the city's finances and the union's demands and issues a report. They basically say, actually, the city can afford this raise, or no, the city is broke and the union is asking for too much.
It puts the objective truth on the table.
Exactly. So there are reality checks built in. You can't just demand $1 million.
Okay.
Huge reality checks. And then there are cooling off periods, strict notice requirements. You have to tell the public weeks in advance. And crucially, for essential services like fire and EMS, there are maintenance of service agreements.
Cleaning.
Meaning you have to keep a skeleton crew. You ensure that life safety isn't compromised. The source points to a chart showing that many other jurisdictions, places like Los Angeles, Chicago, parts of Europe, already permit public sector strikes under these exact conditions.
So the argument is, this isn't some radical new experiment.
No, it's actually quite standard. It's about aligning DC with proven frameworks that exist elsewhere. It's not about burning the city down. It's about having the option.
It goes back to that recalculation of value.
Exactly. Even if you never strike. And statistically, most unions with the right to strike rarely use it. The fact that you can changes the conversation at the bargaining table.
It turns begging back into negotiating.
That's the idea.
I want to pivot to the listener for a second, because we have listeners all over the country, not just in D.C. Why should someone in Ohio or California care about the nuances of D.C. labor law or the mechanics of a control board?
I think it matters because it exposes a universal truth about the difference between care and rights.
There's more about that.
Well, in every city, in every workplace, we often settle for temporary fixes. We see a problem: low wages, bad housing, underfunded schools, and we want a quick fix. We want a relief fund.
We want a benevolent leader to sign an executive order.
We want the pain to stop. We want the solution handed to us. We want a hero.
Right.
But the source is challenging us to look deeper. Those are illusions. True dignity, whether for a community or a worker, requires structural change. It requires agency.
If you can't participate in the decision-making, if you don't have the leverage to influence the outcome, you are just a subject, not a citizen.
It's the difference between being given a fish and having the right to hold the fishing rod.
And the right to decide where to fish.
And the right to dispute the size of the catch. It's about maturing the relationship between the governing and the governed.
We've covered a lot of ground today. We started with that household metaphor, seeing how care can often just mask control. We looked at the strategic failure of defensive governance.
How trying to be invisible didn't save D.C. from congressional overreach.
And we finished with a roadmap. It's not a hopeless situation. The agency through readiness strategy suggests that preparation is a form of power.
It moves the discussion away from, is this political suicide, to, is the alternative actually any safer?
That's the real question. The source makes a profound observation about governance by permission. If your ability to govern your city or negotiate your wages depends entirely on the good mood of a superior power, do you actually have rights?
Or do you just have privileges?
Privileges that can be revoked at any moment.
The second that mood changes.
And I want to leave you with this thought, drawn directly from that critique of the last 13 months. The source suggests that silence didn't save the status quo. It didn't protect home rule. It didn't get the workers a fair contract.
It just bought a little bit of time at the cost of dignity.
So if staying quiet didn't work, what is actually lost by speaking up? If the worst case scenario is already happening in slow motion, maybe the biggest risk is taking no risk at all.
Couldn't have said it better.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.